Much for joining us for our last word. This is the last word. You have the last word before we get into Holy Week and Easter. Today we want to welcome Ann Kniggendorf. Ann is a staff writer and editor for the Kansas City Public Library. She is author of Secret Kansas City and co-author of Kansas City Scavenger. She's a freelance writer who also contributes to KCUR, The Star, and The Pitch. She's been published by the Smithsonian, National Public Radio, Saturday Evening Post, on and on and on and on and on and on. Lots and lots and lots of places that she has been published. She is also the producer of a podcast for LitHub, and it's called Fiction Nonfiction. Yeah. She's a graduate of St. John's College in Santa Fe, has a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing and Media Arts from the University of Missouri, Kansas City, where she serves on the College of Arts and Sciences Alumni Board. She's a graduate of the Defense Language Institute Foreign Language Center in Montgomery, California, and is a Navy veteran. So please welcome Ann Kniggendorf. Ann?
Thank you. Thanks for clapping. So I'm Ann Kniggendorf. I do quite a bit of public speaking, but the only times I've spoken at church were either in the capacity of a lay reader at St. Luke's and Shawnee, where I'm a member, or giving eulogies. And so I kind of warned Mother Kelly that that might influence my tone today. And that's only partly a joke, so. So usually when I speak somewhere, it's about my books, Secret Kansas City and Kansas City Scavenger. I wrote that second one with my sister. Those are local interest books, and they're a little on the silly side, particularly the scavenger hunt book, which is made up of rhyming riddles. And I have some, if you feel like looking at them after this, you may. My main job, as Mother Kelly said, was as a writer for the Kansas City Public Library. And in that role, I'm often on stage interviewing other people about their books. So public speaking is, yes, something I do, but not what I'm doing today. And this is a little different. As you probably all know from having been to these talks, my prompt is to say what I would if this were the last time I addressed an audience. So not about my books, though they will give me a way into what I have to say, so you will hear a little bit about that. And before I get going, I feel like I should confess that I haven't studied any difficult sciences. I haven't done any groundbreaking research. I haven't even sifted through exciting and obscure archives revealing deep truths about humanity, nothing like that. So I feel like I'm not really in a position to tell you anything new. Instead, I'll see if I can manage a kind of reminder. So the way I usually begin a talk is to tell a little bit about myself and how I came to write the two books, which I think will still work out today to start with. I grew up in the Shawnee Mission School District, and I graduated from North. From kindergarten through 12th grade, I wrote stuff. One of my earliest memories is of writing loops across a page, imitating cursive. I think that memory is from before I knew how to read, or probably before I even knew the alphabet. So in the beginning, it was that my hand wanted to write. Maybe a case of the body knowing before the brain, which I've heard happens more than we realize, like in fear responses, you know, that your body reacts first. So excuse me. I think I also should take a sip before I wobble this off onto the floor. There, not as full. In second grade, I told my teacher that I'd like to write for whatever semblance of a school paper we had, and she told me no. You'd think that an 8-year-old using a word like semblance would have gotten her attention. I'm kidding, I didn't really say semblance. But she still said no. She said I wasn't a strong enough student, and she wouldn't let me write for it. These days, that story gets a lot of groans and head slaps, but I think that was a pretty typical teacher answer in the early 80s, at least in my experience. Or maybe people just tell me no a lot, I don't know. So of course, what I did for the rest of my school career was find ways to give that teacher the middle finger. Even though she wasn't an English teacher, I had a chip on my shoulder with English teachers from then on, even as I begged to be allowed into honors English class, which I finally managed in 10th grade, only to learn that my very first assignment in honors English was to make a collage. So I was really mad about that because I wanted, diagramming of sentences and treacherous writing assignments, with lots of footnotes required and, close readings of poetry and experimental fiction. I wanted it to be really hard, but instead I pulled out some old magazines and scissors and glue. So in high school, I did write for the school paper, and I also wrote quite a few plays that I got to put on in North's Little Theater, which was a huge thrill. I think I wrote 5 altogether. In college, I kept writing. I went to St. John's College in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and had a column called Ask AK that I wrote for 7 semesters before I graduated with a degree in Western philosophy and historical mathematics. Now, you might think that after earning a degree like that, I'd have no hang-up about saying that I wanted to be a writer as a career. It's not as if I'd trained to be a dentist or an engineer or a brain surgeon or something, right? I mean, the historical philosophy and yeah, so it was. But instead I told myself that writing wasn't a real job at all. And I'm pretty sure I thought that because I hadn't really been around people who wrote as a profession. So I tormented myself with this for a really long time. Here it was the only thing I felt qualified to do, and it was also the only thing I actually wanted to do, and I wouldn't allow myself to even consider it. I had no helpful perspective. I knew how I felt, I knew what I wanted, but I told myself no because I just couldn't see a path, and that was that. That was the end of the discussion with myself. So instead I enlisted in the Navy, because right, what else are you going to do? In my defense, I did have a plan. I'd been interested in linguistics for years, so I told myself that I'd spend a year in KU's graduate program in linguistics, and if I didn't love it, I'd enlist in the Navy and become a linguist that way. I put that in quotation marks because an academic linguist and a Department of Defense linguist are not the same thing. In the Navy, it would mean that I went to the Defense Language Institute in Monterey to learn a language. In my case, it was Arabic. When I was 23, this looked like a career path, and while writing didn't look like a career path. And that was just so stuck in my head, again, that I didn't even question it. To make a long story short, I did not love the program at KU. So I dropped out halfway through my master's work, and I enlisted. In the 6 years I served, I had 2 sons, and I wasn't about to be deployed for months at a time and never see them, so I separated from the Navy, thereby, guess what, scrapping that career path. And guess what was left? Writing stuff. So it's hard not to think that if I'd listened to myself as a kid, I'd have won some huge award by now, maybe. Really big, think big. Or I would at least have a career on par with others who started when they were in their 20s, who are my age now. Instead, I finished a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing just after my 39th birthday, paid for with my GI Bill. That part was really good. But once I'd given myself the green light to making writing a career, the problem was how to make money. Career equals making money doing something, and I wanted a career, not a hobby. Ultimately, I pretty much just weaseled my way into newsroom after newsroom around town, starting with the Star. It turns out that once the Star says okay to you, other publications will say, oh, you wrote for the Star, sure, you must be okay. And even the Smithsonian Magazine said that, and that was pretty great. So since then, I've done public radio work, as Mother Kelly said, and written for some nationally and internationally read publications, and that's how a little press in St. Louis called Reedy found me and asked me to write the 2 Kansas City books. So the first was Secret Kansas City, and the assignment was to write 90 300-word stories about places around town that qualified as weird, wonderful, or obscure. By stories, I don't mean fictional accounts. I mean that I needed to research all these places really, really well and then write these little stories based on my research. But 90 places. And the places had to qualify as one of those 3 super subjective words, weird, wonderful, or obscure. I didn't know where to begin. And even if I'd been told to write about boring places, 90 would still have been a little rough. I did a few things to compile the initial list. Of course, I Googled like mad, but the problem with that was if I searched for weird stuff in Kansas City, only places that plenty of other people already thought were weird pulled up. So I got spots like Leila's Hair Museum in Independence, which is definitely weird and maybe closed now, I'm not sure. Has anyone heard of the Hair Museum or been there? Yeah, a couple of you. So that one's definitely weird and a really great place to go. And then I also got a lot of places in my searches online that were haunted or things about tunnels, and even things that turned out not to be true at all, like that the Power and Light building was the inspiration for the Shandor building in Ghostbusters. I don't know if you remember that part, the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man explodes. So there's a big rumor around Kansas City that building was inspired by Kansas City Power and Light, and that's not true at all. But it was fun to think about for a minute, and I actually did write my one story about that, and then I realized, no, I'm perpetuating a rumor. I can't do that. So I also asked a couple of groups on Facebook for help, and it turned out that people on one Kansas City history page were really helpful. I think I had over 300 responses from that group the first day the post was up. But, here I'm getting to my point. But what I found most interesting was in my third approach to gathering ideas. Everywhere I went for months, grocery stores, car places, hair places, really just anywhere I went, I would kind of sidle up to strangers and I would say, hey, I'm working on a project about weird places in Kansas City. Do you know any? Can you think of any? And can you guess what the most common response was? Anybody? Yeah, everybody said, no, there's nothing weird. They said, there's nothing weird around here. I can't think of anything weird at all. Get away from me. They usually didn't say that last part aloud, but I could still hear them thinking it. So it took me months to realize why I got this response. Aside from that I myself was being creepy and weird, asking strangers this question, can anyone think of what was going on, why everyone said there were no such places around here? Anybody have an idea? Well, when you live with something, when you drive by something all the time, year after year, there's nothing strange about it, right? So even if it's got the most bizarre backstory anybody's ever heard, it just seems normal, right? So chances are, if you're that used to something, you've never even bothered to find out the backstory, because why would you? Because the people I spoke to were accustomed to their surroundings, as I was accustomed to the idea that I didn't want to write, that I wanted to write, but that writing wasn't a job. All those people, just like I did, stopped, and they didn't look any further. So something similar happened while my sister and I were working on the scavenger hunt book. The task there was to create 370 clues over 20 walkable parts of town, and then take pictures of all those places and write rhyming riddles. These are the things I get myself into. Has anyone here ever put together a scavenger hunt, like for little kids or anything like that? Okay, yes, some of you. It's tricky, isn't it? It's harder than you'd think. And then especially one on this scale. This was huge. The book is about this thick. It's big. Luckily, we had lots of help from friends and family, and some tromped around with us looking for possible sites, and others helped us write and edit the poems. And just as I discovered that what people see every day doesn't really strike them as unusual, we learned with this project that unless you're specifically looking for interesting little architectural flourishes or oddities in sidewalks or details in murals or on public art installations, you'll probably just keep on walking. My sister and I live in Shawnee, so that was the first area we worked on. And I had, when we walked around and really started looking like that, I learned that we had a time capsule buried near City Hall. I'd never noticed before. I'd also never stopped to read the historic marker about Quantrill's raid on Shawnee. That's just sitting there in plain sight. And so once we set our minds to really looking at what we thought was so familiar to us, that's when we started to see what was actually there. Here's where this talk takes a little turn. I found out that this trick of perspective works with people, even with ourselves. So just as all along I'd had that interest in writing staring me in the face, but stuck to my internal script about it, and just as hundreds of little spots around town didn't seem special because I'd looked at them too many times, or the details up and down the street were too little to even bother noticing, the same can happen with the people in our lives we're just used to. I recently had a profound experience with this. I say experience, but it was really a relationship, a great romantic relationship, But the trouble is that that relationship was cut short, by my estimate, as many as 20 or even 30 years, when the person I'm going to talk about passed away in December. Here is what happened. One time, I was married for 20 years. There was that time. Toward the start of the pandemic, my now ex-husband left me, and this was jarring and difficult, but not totally unexpected, and the timing was just kind of strange, like during the pandemic. I worked through it, and I felt like I was doing okay, and I certainly wasn't interested in any kind of new relationship. Then one evening that fall, the fall of 2020, I had a Facebook message from a very old friend named Jeremy. Back when we were 12, he'd been the first boy who'd ever liked me back. And back then, we had a 3-week romance that ended when he hurt my feelings. He got a lot of mileage out of that story when I told him later about it. The rest of our school years, we were around each other all the time because we were in the same social circle and did the same activities. And while we continued to talk and always liked each other, I don't think we were ever alone again after that time when we were 12, and we were never close. Still, I felt like I knew him, because why wouldn't I? Through social media and information from his mom, who's right there, I kept up with what was going on in his life. We all have people like this, right? The ones we feel like we know, the ones who are like the markers we drive by and never read, or even the Hereford Bull way up in the sky, that statue off of the highway, and we never bother to think about that, right? What's strange about that? That's how Jeremy was for me. So there he was messaging me out of nowhere, asking if he could call, and I felt a little suspicious of him. I knew he was also divorced, and I was friends with his mom through church, but still. The last time we'd seen each other had been at our 20th high school reunion in 2013, and we had both had way too much to drink, and he'd suddenly become the only person in the room I wanted to speak to or look at or stand next to. And while nothing happened, that impulse was wildly inappropriate because we were both still married. But looking back, that seems an awful lot to me like that story I told you a bit ago about writing with the loops before I knew how to write. Some part of me seemed to know, even though I was not consciously interested in him at all, that he was my person. And I'd hardly given him a thought since we graduated, but there I was glued to him at this reunion. So that night in 2020 when he asked to talk, I told him we could, but only because I was curious and I was not happy about it. Later he told me I didn't sound good at all that first time we talked, angry even. But he had insisted on the phone he really wasn't up to anything. It was just that his spouse had left him 2 years before mine had, and he wanted to know how I was doing. I told him I was just fine, and he laughed at me. He told me I wasn't fine at all. Maybe that's when I started to sound angry. Because who was this little puke from 7th grade or this angst-ridden black t-shirt wearing boy from high school to tell me that I wasn't doing fine? Of course, he was right. It took me months to admit it, though. We went on that way for an entire year. He kept checking on me, and we'd talk for maybe 45 minutes before I made an excuse and got off the phone. I didn't know it, but I was stubbornly refusing to see anyone other than that kid I used to know or that adult I'd watched on social media. Why do we do that to people? Is it just easier that way? Is our capacity to pay attention to others and to our surroundings and even to ourselves really so limited that we have to hang on to outdated ideas or ones that were never right to begin with? Who are you treating that way right now? And why? Jeremy wasn't picking up on me. He wasn't like that. He wasn't checking on me over and over to figure out if I might want to go out with him. In fact, he lived on the other side of St. Louis, so not someone I could start seeing all the time if I'd wanted to. No, he was looking for connection for his own mental health, and he was also genuinely concerned about an old friend going through a tough situation he'd already been through. He was supporting me because he knew that he knew how to support me. Then one night, it was my parents' 50th wedding anniversary. Jeremy and I stayed on the phone for 7 hours. We laughed like wild, we cried a little, you name it, we talked about it. Neither one of us wanted to stop talking and had no idea 7 hours had gone by. And then the next day I was walking through my house and I had another of those making loops experiences and another one of those 20th reunion experiences. I was alone, the sun was shining through the windows. I remember I was next to my couch in the living room when suddenly my mouth dried out and my stomach filled with butterflies and I felt weak in the knees, literally, and I had to sit down to figure out what is going on. Maybe I'm having a stroke, I don't know what this is. And so again, my body knew before I did that I was suddenly crazy about this person. So I'll skip over most of the rest. But I will say that our challenging marriages had us pretty scared to move very fast with each other. So we spent another year creeping closer and closer. And it was during that time that I figured out I knew absolutely nothing about Jeremy. I didn't know how badly he'd been bullied in middle school, even though I had been right there in the same building and knew the kids who were doing it. I didn't know any of the stories behind the nutty things I'd heard that he'd done in high school. I didn't know anything about the most meaningful parts of the life he'd built as an adult. I didn't know he was a good Episcopalian and had been the senior warden and junior warden at his last church. I didn't know how kind he was, nothing. And that worked both ways. We weren't just catching up with each other, we were finally getting to know each other. So in talking to him about my life, I also began to see all the experiences and decisions I'd made that I hadn't thought much about from another angle, any angle but my own. So what things about myself had I failed or refused to see? How would my life be different if I could see myself the way Jeremy saw me? And what would change for him if he could see himself the way I did? It turns out a lot changed for the better for both of us. So depending on how we count it, we either had a good 2.5 years or a 1.5 years together, or maybe only 4 months before he passed away. 4 months was how long we'd been seeing each other as often as possible, traveling back and forth across Missouri. Or maybe 35 years. But that's another way to count it, but that was when we were no more to each other than a forgotten or ignored time capsule, right? Buried outside of City Hall. So in countless ways, my life has been better since I started writing professionally about 9 years ago. It's like I'm finally myself. And in 1,000 ways, my travel around town, walking or by car, is also much better now that I have this perspective that there are weird and wonderful stories around every corner, and from the sidewalk all the way up to the rooftops of the buildings that I see all the time. And of course, saying yes to Jeremy and seeing him for who he really was and letting him see me for who I really am changed my life completely and improved it in so many ways. Now, all of this isn't to say that you can go home and look up your first love on Facebook and expect similar results. I never expected any of what happened start to finish. Jeremy gave me the greatest good surprise and the most devastating bad surprise of my entire life. No, I only mean to remind us, all of us, to look just a little harder at the people and places we see every day, and even at ourselves. Learn the story behind that lone headstone you pass on Johnson Drive. Ask that buddy you've known for decades what was really going on in his life during a time that stuck with you, or what's going on right now even. And really be honest with yourself about what you want and why you've thought that you can't have it. So much opens up when we start really looking. Thank you. That's all. And if anybody has questions about any of that, then let me know, but I don't know what I can possibly say.
So lovely. Are there questions that you have? Yeah. I know that Reedy?
Reedy.
Publishing gave you those 2 ideas. Mm-hmm. But do you have any plans for anything for yourself?
Oh, okay, so the question was if she has plans for writing more books, ideas of your own that don't come from publishers.
Yeah, I have a book I've been working on for about 10 years. It's about my time in basic training, and it's I always have a hard time describing it, which is why it's not done. But I have a good 300 pages about the intersection of military discipline with the liberal arts. So, a philosophy student going to boot camp, how does that work and what happens? So I do have 300 pages on that. So if you know any agents, you let me know.
Beautiful. Any other? Yes, hold on. I'll give you the microphone.
I'm a retired librarian and wonder how you came to the Kansas City, Missouri Public Library.
Well, as I'd said, I've been writing for years and years, and it's hard to get the word writer on a business card that someone else makes for you. So I found the job at the library that was, is listed writer-editor at a library. So to me, what could be better? and I applied for the job, and I got it. I think the library is an ideal place to work, especially in the capacity of a writer. Someone has to write all those books, right? But yeah, it was kind of just in a job search, just looking and looking, and that was just the right thing.
Other questions?
What did you do as a linguist in the Navy?
I can't really tell you. Great, well then this is a short conversation, isn't it?
The question was what she did as a linguist in the Navy, so.
Yeah, I went to Monterey, California, to the Defense Language Institute, and then I trained for a while in Texas, and then I was stationed in Georgia on an Army base, even though I was in the Navy. So, you too, in Georgia?
Fort Ritchie, Maryland.
Oh, okay.
I was in the Navy, 3,000 feet underground.
Oh, gosh. Okay, well, I'm glad I didn't have to go 3,000 feet underground. But yeah, that's loosely, you're in the ballpark of what I did, to answer your question.
Ooh, there's a lot happening there that we are not privy to, and I think I'm
No.
glad. Any other questions? Good. Well, thank you. What a delight. And that talk was just lovely. Thank you so much for sharing your gift with us and your story. So thank you all again for coming. Let's thank